The blizzard hit at midnight. By morning, 16 driveways were buried under 4 feet of snow, and only one man in Cedar Brook Hollow owned a plow. The HOA had spent 3 months making his life hell. Now, they needed him, and he hadn't touched his keys yet. Callum Bryce had built his snow removal business from nothing. Not from a loan, not from a handout, not from a family connection or a lucky break. He had built it with cracked knuckles and pre-dawn starts and a second-hand truck he had nursed back to life in a rented garage with no heat and a single work light dangling from a hook above his head. He had named the truck Ruth after his late mother, and he had driven her through 11 winters across the rural edge of Fairmont County, carving a reputation so solid that by the time he bought his house on Sycamore Ridge Drive in the Cedar Brook Hollow subdivision, he had a client list of 43 properties and a waiting list of 11 more. He had moved into the neighborhood in late October of that year, 2 weeks before the first frost. The house was a modest colonial with green shutters and a wide driveway that curved slightly uphill from the street. His nearest neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Dorothea Marsh, had waved at him from across the fence on his first morning and told him the neighborhood was quiet, mostly, except for the HOA meetings, which she attended out of obligation, and left feeling slightly worse about humanity. Callum had laughed at that. He had not yet met the HOA board. He met them in November, at a mandatory new resident orientation in the community clubhouse, a low brick building at the entrance of the subdivision that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and old coffee. The board president was a man named Reginald Foss. He was perhaps 60, broad in the shoulders, but soft in the middle, with a silver comb-over he maintained, with visible effort, and a way of speaking that made every sentence sound like a prepared statement. He welcomed Callum with a handshake that lasted half a second longer than necessary, and immediately asked what Callum did for a living. When Callum told him, Foss's expression shifted in a way that was difficult to name. Not hostile, not quite dismissive, but something in between. The look of a man recalibrating where someone belonged in his mental hierarchy. The other board members were introduced in quick succession. There was Nadine Kowalczyk, the treasurer, a compact woman in her late 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and a talent for making polite observations that landed like small accusations. There was Porter Salas, the architectural review chair, who had the restless energy of a man waiting for permission to care about something. And there was Bev Tanaka, the secretary, who said almost nothing the entire evening and took notes on a legal pad with a green pen. Callum shook all their hands. He smiled. He accepted a laminated copy of the Cedar Brook Hollow Community Standards and Covenant Agreement, which was 47 pages long. He drove home and put it on his kitchen counter, and did not look at it for 2 weeks. That was his first mistake. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late November. It was printed on cream-colored HOA letterhead and informed him that his truck Ruth, his 2008 Ford F350 with the plow attachment and the magnetic business signs on both doors, was in violation of Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the Community Standards, which prohibited commercial vehicles from being parked in residential driveways or on public streets within the subdivision between the hours of 6 in the evening and 8 in the morning. Callum read the letter twice. Then he read the relevant section of the covenant agreement. The language was clear enough. Commercial vehicles, defined as any vehicle bearing signage, a mounted apparatus, or other visible indication of commercial use, were prohibited. He could remove the magnetic signs. That was simple. But the plow was bolted to the front of the truck, and removing it between every evening and morning of the winter months was not only impractical, but physically damaging to the mounting hardware. He had done seasonal plow removal before when storage required it, and it was a 2-person job that took the better part of an hour. He wrote back to the board with a measured, professional tone. He explained the situation. He asked whether a variance could be granted, as the truck was his primary tool of livelihood and was kept clean, free of leaking fluids, and positioned entirely within his own driveway, without encroaching on the street or any neighboring property. He attached a photograph showing the truck neatly parked and a brief summary of his business for context. Foss replied within 48 hours. The answer was no. No variance. No exception. The covenant was the covenant, and it applied equally to all residents regardless of occupation. If Callum found this arrangement inconvenient, he was welcome to store the vehicle at a commercial facility during the restricted hours. Callum stared at that response for a long time. He thought about the cost of renting storage space. He thought about the logistics of retrieving a plowing truck at 4 in the morning when a storm call came in. He thought about his 43 clients and the 11 people on his waiting list, and the simple, unambiguous fact that his business depended on his ability to respond quickly to weather events that did not schedule themselves. According to HOA parking hours, he rented a storage unit 8 miles away. It cost him $210 a month. He absorbed the cost without complaint. He drove Ruth to the unit every evening before 6 and retrieved her every morning and drove her back after 8 unless a storm was already in progress. In which case, he simply did not return her until the work was finished and the streets were clear. This arrangement lasted 3 weeks before the second letter arrived. This one was about his trailer. He owned a utility trailer he used to haul equipment, salt spreaders, and spare parts during peak season. He had been storing it along the side of his house, partly shielded from the street by a row of arborvitae that the previous owners had planted. The letter cited Section 6, Paragraph 3, which prohibited the open-air storage of trailers, watercraft, or recreational vehicles anywhere on residential lots within the subdivision. He wrote back again. He asked about a rear yard storage exemption, which he had noticed referenced elsewhere in the document. The board replied that the exemption required the storage structure to be screened on all 4 sides by a solid fence or enclosure of no less than 6 feet in height, and that any such structure required prior architectural review and board approval before construction could begin. He submitted an architectural review application in December. He did not hear back for 6 weeks. In the meantime, he moved the trailer to the same storage facility as Ruth. His monthly storage cost was now $340. Dorothea Marsh brought him a plate of gingerbread cookies in the second week of December and told him, with the quiet certainty of someone who had watched this pattern before, that Reginald Foss had taken a dislike to him and that this rarely ended well for the person Foss had taken the dislike to. She said it without drama, as a simple statement of observed fact. The way she might have told him that a particular stretch of road flooded every spring. Callum thanked her for the cookies and asked what she thought he had done to earn the dislike. Dorothea looked at Ruth, parked momentarily in the driveway before her evening trip to storage, and said, "You remind him that some people don't need what he has. That always bothers men like Reginald." She went back inside. Callum stood in the cold for a moment thinking about that. Then he loaded a bag of ice melt into Ruth's bed and drove to his first storm prep call of the season. The winter that year was active. By mid-January, Fairmont County had logged 3 significant snowfall events and 1 ice storm that had shut down the county roads for 18 hours. Callum had worked through all of them. He had plowed commercial lots and residential driveways and church parking areas. He had salted sidewalks at 3 in the morning and pulled 2 motorists out of ditches on Route 9 using the recovery strap he kept bolted to Ruth's rear bumper. Through all of it, his own neighborhood, Cedar Brook Hollow, had not been among his clients. The HOA contracted with a landscaping company called Greenline Services for snow removal, and Greenline had a contract that covered the subdivision's common areas, the entrance, the clubhouse lot, and the main interior road. Private driveways were each resident's individual responsibility. Most of Callum's neighbors hired out or managed their own driveways with snowblowers and shovels. A few, he noticed, struggled. The Wharton family at the end of the street had an elderly man Callum assumed was a grandfather who shoveled alone, slowly, after every storm. The couple at number 14 had a driveway that turned uphill and was regularly glazed with ice by the time the sun hit it. Dorothea, who was 71 and had a bad hip, paid a teenager from the next subdivision to come by. But the teenager was unreliable and twice did not show at all. On 3 separate occasions during January storms, Callum had made passes down Sycamore Ridge Drive with Ruth on his way in or out, and had quickly cleared the street end of several driveways as a courtesy. The small push of accumulated curbside snow that the plow throw created when the street was serviced. He had not charged anyone. He had not announced it. He had simply done it because he had the equipment, and it took 30 seconds per house. He had not expected that this would create a problem. The third letter arrived in late January. This one informed him that he had been observed operating a commercial vehicle within the subdivision outside of the permitted hours on multiple dates, and that this constituted a violation of Section 4, Paragraph 12. The letter further noted that conducting commercial activity within the subdivision without prior board authorization was a violation of Section 9, Paragraph 1. He was being fined $250 for each of 3 documented incidents, for a total of $750, payable within 30 days. Callum read the letter standing at his kitchen counter. He was still in his work gear. He had been up since 3 in the morning. He had plowed 11 driveways and a commercial lot and a church parking area, and he had eaten a gas station sandwich at some point around 7, because there had been no time to stop. He set the letter down on the counter. He took off his gloves. He ran cold water over his hands at the sink, and stood there for a moment watching the water run. He was not, by nature, a reactive person. He had learned patience from his mother, who had raised him and his younger sister alone after their father left, and had done it with the methodical dignity that Callum had absorbed more deeply than he had realized until he was an adult. Ruth Bryce had not raged against difficulty. She had assessed it, planned around it, and moved forward with her eyes open. But he was tired, and the fine was real money, and he had been fined for helping his neighbors at no charge in the middle of a storm. He wrote back that evening. The letter was longer this time. He noted that his passes down the street had been courtesy gestures with no charge to any resident, that no commercial transaction had occurred, and that classifying a voluntary, unpaid act of community assistance as a commercial violation was a significant overreach of the HOA's authority. He requested the evidence of the documented incidents, as was his right under the covenant's dispute provisions. He also requested, formally, an emergency variance hearing before the board. Foss replied in writing 5 days later. The fines were upheld. The variance hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. The evidence, which consisted of photographs taken by an unnamed party, would be made available at the hearing. Callum contacted a property law attorney named Vera Sundstrom, whose office was in Fairmont Center. He spent 90 minutes with her, going through the covenant and the letter exchange. Vera read everything carefully, and told him that the fines were on shakier legal ground than the board appeared to believe, particularly the commercial activity violation, since no payment had changed hands, and therefore no commercial transaction had legally occurred. She advised him to dispute the fines formally at the hearing and to document every further interaction with the board carefully. He thanked her and asked her fee. She told him, and he wrote the check. Added to his storage costs, the winter was becoming expensive in ways that had nothing to do with fuel or equipment maintenance. He told no one in the neighborhood what was happening, except Dorothea, who already knew because she had seen the code enforcement officer photograph his truck from the street one morning in January, and had recognized the man as a cousin of Porter Salas. Porter keeps notes on everyone, Dorothea said. She was at his kitchen table drinking the coffee he had made, which she said was too strong, but drank anyway. He drove past the Nguyen house 3 times last summer, timing how long their guests' cars sat in front. He's that kind of person. Callum asked if there was anything in the neighborhood that Foss genuinely cared about, beyond enforcement. Dorothea thought about it. His position, she said, and the appearance of control. That's about it. February arrived cold and brittle. The variance hearing took place on a Wednesday evening in the clubhouse. Callum presented his case carefully and without emotion. He explained the courtesy nature of the passes, the absence of any billing or compensation, and cited relevant case law that Vera had outlined for him regarding the definition of commercial activity in residential covenant disputes. He asked the board to reconsider the fines. Foss listened with his hands folded on the table and his expression neutral. When Callum finished, Foss said that the board appreciated his perspective, but that the spirit of the covenant was clear, and that the board had both the right and the obligation to maintain community standards consistently. For the benefit of all residents, the fines were upheld by a vote of 4-1. Bev Tanaka, the secretary, voted against. She did not explain her vote. Callum drove home in the dark. He sat in Ruth's cab in the parking lot of the storage facility for several minutes before driving her inside. He thought about Vera's advice. He thought about Dorothea's observation. He thought about the $750, which he paid the following week to avoid additional penalties, and he made a decision that was very simple and very quiet. He would not plow a single driveway in Cedar Brook Hollow. Not one. Not as a courtesy. Not for payment. Not for any reason. He would drive Ruth in and out of the subdivision to his storage unit as required. And he would do his work across the 43 other properties on his list. And he would do nothing for the 16 houses on Sycamore Ridge Drive other than what any other neighbor did, which was nothing at all. This decision cost him nothing. He had never been paid by any of them anyway. They had not been his clients. He owed them no obligation under any agreement or contract. He felt no anger about it. That was the cleanest part. He did not even feel particularly resolved. He simply looked at the situation with clear eyes and recognized that the most sensible response to a community that had fined him for helping was to stop helping. He stopped. He went back to his work. He serviced his 43 properties. He answered calls and sent invoices, and maintained Ruth with the care he had always given her. February passed without significant event. There were 2 moderate snowfalls, 4 to 6 inches each, manageable enough that Sycamore Ridge Drive's residents handled their driveways without obvious crisis. Callum watched none of it. He drove past the driveways on his way to the storage unit, and the driveways were driveways. And he kept his eyes forward. It was in the second week of February that Reginald Foss appeared at Callum's door on a Saturday morning. He was wearing a North Face jacket and a plaid scarf, and he had the look of a man who had prepared for a negotiation. He smiled at Callum with the particular warmth of someone who needed something, and had decided to temporarily realign their interpersonal bearing to get it. He proposed a neighborhood snow removal contract. He said the board had discussed it, and agreed that Callum's proximity and equipment made him the most practical choice for servicing residents' driveways, and that the HOA could facilitate a community rate arrangement that would be convenient for everyone and would represent a meaningful income supplement for Callum's business during peak season. Callum listened to all of this on his front step, his arms crossed loosely, his coffee still in his hand. He asked what rate the board had in mind. Foss named a figure. It was approximately 60% of Callum's standard residential rate. Callum asked if the board had surveyed the residents to determine interest. Foss said the board would handle coordination on behalf of the community, as it did with all shared services. Callum asked whether the contract would require him to respond to calls outside of the HOA's approved vehicle hours, and if so, how. The board proposed to reconcile that with the existing parking covenant. Foss's smile held, but its quality changed. He said that the board had flexibility on operational logistics. Callum said he appreciated the conversation and that he would think about it. Foss left. Callum went back inside, refilled his coffee, and called Vera Sundstrom to describe the visit. Vera laughed, not unkindly, and said that the offer sounded like a 60% rate, with full liability and no covenant relief, and that he should decline. He declined by letter the following Monday. He thanked the board for the proposal, and noted that at the offered rate, combined with ongoing. Foss was quiet for a moment. Then, he asked, with the tight, careful control that Callum recognized as the sound of someone managing their own surprise, whether Callum was declining to help his own neighbors in an emergency. Callum said he was declining to provide commercial services for which he had no current availability, and that his existing clients, whose properties he had been contracted to service, came first. He said he hoped Foss understood the logic of that arrangement. Foss said, "You could make time if you wanted to." Callum said, "I could. I'm choosing not to. I have clients depending on me." There was a longer silence. Foss said, "I see." Callum said, "Good luck today." The contractor I mentioned is good. He may have something available if you call early enough." He ended the call. He sat for a moment. Outside, the storm was moving through its worst band, the snow coming at an angle that made visibility difficult beyond 50 feet. Ruth's cab was warm and smelled of coffee from the thermos wedged against the center console. He thought about the man-to-man phrase again. He thought about what it assumed that there was between them, some common fraternity of men that superseded the documented record of fines and rejections, and the $750 he had paid because he had helped these people for free. He thought about the assumption embedded in the phrase, which was that Callum's refusal required justification, that a man who chose not to help in an emergency was doing something that needed to be explained rather than simply understood as the natural consequence of how he had been treated. He felt no triumph. He had expected to feel something sharper, but there was nothing sharp in it. It was simply the result of a calculation that had been running since January. The HOA had made a decision about who Callum was to them. He had made a decision in response. The storm had arrived. The math was the math. He finished his coffee and made the next pass. By early afternoon, the calls had expanded. He received one from Porter Salas, whose voicemail was brief and awkward, a man not accustomed to asking for things who had run out of alternatives. He received one from a resident named Celia Drummond at number 7 who had a newborn and needed to get to a pediatrician appointment. He received one from an older man at number 31 who identified himself as Harold Vetch and said he had been trying to reach anyone for 3 hours. Callum called Harold Vetch back. He was the only one he called back directly, because the man's voice had sounded genuinely frightened, and Callum was not unmoved by that. He asked Harold if he had a medical emergency. Harold said no, not yet, but he was out of blood pressure medication and hadn't been able to get out in 2 days, and today was supposed to be when he went. Callum asked if the medication was critical in the next 24 hours. Harold said he thought he could manage until tomorrow if the roads cleared. Callum said the county roads were being plowed and should be passable by morning. He said if Harold needed anything urgently, he should call his pharmacy about emergency delivery options, which some pharmacies in the county provided during declared weather events, and he gave him the name of one that he knew offered the service. He told Harold to call him directly if things changed and a genuine emergency developed. Harold thanked him 3 times. Callum felt something then. Not guilt, not regret, a kind of sorrow for the shape of things. Harold Vetch was not Reginald Foss. Harold Vetch was an old man who had lived on his street for probably 30 years and had nothing to do with fine letters or covenant citations. And yet the situation. Callum had no availability. He had 11 properties on his route, committed clients who had paid him and counted on him. And he had a finite number of hours and a finite amount of fuel, and a body that had already been running for 14 hours. He could not help Harold Vetch today without failing someone else. And the someone else had a contract. He drove to his next client at T2 in the afternoon. The storm began to taper. The heaviest band had passed east, and the rate dropped to a steady 1 inch per hour, which was manageable. The total accumulation on Sycamore Ridge Drive, based on what Callum could see on his passes to and from the storage unit, was somewhere between 22 and 26 inches, with drifts at the mouth of several driveways reaching nearly 4 feet where the street plow had thrown. He saw Foss's car briefly. From a distance, the black Audi SUV sitting fully buried at the top of the driveway. He saw Porter Salas's wife standing on her front step, looking at the driveway with the expression of someone attempting to calculate the gap between the problem and every available solution and finding the gap too wide. He drove past. He had work to do. By 4 in the afternoon, he had completed 10 of his 11 contracted properties. The final one was a commercial bakery on the east side of Fairmont Center, whose lot access was critical for a morning delivery schedule. He finished that property at 5:45 and sat in Ruth's cab in the bakery parking lot eating a protein bar and drinking water from a bottle that had been in the cup holder since morning. His phone had 23 missed calls and 9 voicemails. 14 of the missed calls were from numbers registered to Sycamore Ridge Drive addresses. He put the phone face down in the cuffholder and drove Ruth to the storage facility. He walked home from the storage facility because it was only 8 blocks and the sidewalks on the main road had been cleared, and he had been sitting in a truck cab for 16 hours and he wanted to walk. The cold was clean and the storm had left everything white and enormous, and the sky had cleared completely and there were more stars than the sky usually showed. He reached Sycamore Ridge Drive and turned down it. The street itself had been plowed by the county sometime in the mid-afternoon. The road was navigable barely. On either side, every driveway was sealed. Some residents had attempted manual clearance and had made partial progress. Narrow paths just wide enough for a person, but no car was getting out of any of these driveways without significant mechanical help. Callum walked the length of the street slowly. He counted the houses. 16 residential properties. At least 12 with driveways that would require plowing. 4 with elderly or physically limited residents. 2 with children young enough to need adult transportation. He walked past all of it. He reached his own driveway, which he had cleared himself that morning before leaving. A quick pass with the shovel he kept in the garage, just enough to get out cleanly. He went inside. He took off his boots. He put a kettle on. He thought about nothing in particular while the water heated. He thought about Ruth, his mother, who had taught him that you could only give what you actually had, and that giving past your capacity was not generosity, but a different kind of failure. He thought about his 43 clients, all of whose driveways were clear tonight because of choices he had made about how to use his time and his equipment. He thought about the bakery on the east side of town, whose delivery trucks would have access in the morning because of choices he had made. The kettle boiled. He made tea. He sat at his kitchen table in the quiet of a post-storm evening and drank it, and was not troubled. His phone buzzed. A text from Dorothea. Power's on. Made soup. Plenty if you want some. He smiled at that and texted back that he would come by in 20 minutes if she was still up. She was still up. She had made potato soup with good bread, and she poured it into a wide bowl and set it in front of him, and sat across the table with her own bowl, and did not ask him anything about the day right away, which was one of the things he liked best about her. After a while she said, "Foss knocked on my door twice. Once asking if I knew how to reach you, once asking if I thought you'd be reasonable." Callum looked up from his soup. Dorothea said, "I told him I didn't know how to reach you. I told him I thought you were very reasonable." Callum ate his soup. Dorothea said, "7 of them are completely stuck. The Salas family, the Kowalczyks, the Foss driveway, obviously. The Drummonds. 3 others." Callum said, "I know." Dorothea said, "Harold Vetch has a neighbor who came over with a snowblower around 4. He's going to be all right." Callum said he was glad to hear that. He meant it. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, and Dorothea refilled his bowl without asking, and he thanked her. Outside, the post-storm silence sat over the neighborhood like a held breath. Everything buried in white and waiting for morning. It was in the morning that the real reckoning arrived. Callum had known it would come. He had not anticipated quite the shape it would take, but he had known the morning would be different from the night. He was up at 6. He had coffee made and was reading a weather summary on his phone when the first knock came at 7:15. He opened the door to find Reginald Foss standing on his step, and for the first time since Callum had known him, Foss looked genuinely diminished. He was in a heavy coat and boots, and he had clearly been outside already, and the work showed on him. His face was red and exhausted. His silver comb-over was uncovered. He was holding his hat in his hands, which was not a small thing for a man like Foss. He said he wanted to talk. Callum opened the door wider and stepped back, and Foss came in. Callum poured him coffee without asking, and set it on the counter between them. Foss wrapped his hands around the mug and looked at Callum with an expression that had moved past the strategic warmth of the Saturday visit, past the tight control of the P.